Chaos erupts on WWE Raw as Brock Lesnar ambushes Bron Breakker and Bronson Reed in a devastating attack. Brock Lesnar just committed an act of violence so brutal and so career-threatening that WWE officials are considering bringing assault charges. Medical personnel are still trying to determine the full extent of the injuries, and both Bron Breakker and Bronson Reed, two of the most destructive monsters in WWE, are now questioning whether they want any part of the war they just started with the Beast incarnate. What happened on Monday Night Raw wasn't a worked angle or a scripted beatdown, it was Brock Lesnar systematically trying to end two careers because these young monsters made the catastrophic mistake of thinking they were actually on his level. But here's what's going to make you absolutely lose your mind and question everything about WWE's safety protocols. Brock Lesnar didn't attack Bron and Bronson during a match or a segment where they could defend themselves. He ambushed them in the parking lot with weapons, with no cameras initially rolling, with the clear intention of causing injuries so severe that both men would be forced out of wrestling permanently. And the only reason we have footage of this assault is because a cameraman heard the chaos and started filming what amounts to attempted murder caught on tape. The most disturbing part is what Brock said during the attack, not threats about future matches or promises of revenge, but specific descriptions of which bones he was breaking, which ligaments he was tearing, and which body parts he was targeting to ensure maximum career damage. This wasn't the Beast incarnate sending a message or establishing dominance, this was a predator systematically destroying prey with the kind of cold calculation that makes everyone who witnessed it genuinely uncomfortable about what Brock Lesnar is actually capable of when he stops following the rules. And WWE's response to this savage assault is what's really going to infuriate you. Instead of immediately suspending Brock and launching an investigation, management is reportedly considering how to turn this legitimate violence into a storyline because the footage is so brutal and so shocking that they know it'll draw massive ratings despite being morally questionable to exploit real injuries for entertainment. The question that should terrify every WWE superstar is this: if Brock Lesnar can ambush two of the company's most protected monsters in the parking lot and nearly end their careers without facing immediate consequences, what's stopping him from doing the same thing to anyone else who he decides has disrespected him or threatened his position? Let me tell you exactly what happened during this devastating ambush, why Brock's attack crossed every line of professional wrestling conduct, and what this means for the immediate safety of everyone on the WWE roster. The situation that led to Brock's ambush had been building for several weeks through a storyline where Bron Breakker and Bronson Reed formed an alliance specifically to prove they were the new dominant monsters in WWE by taking out every established big man on the roster. They'd already attacked several veterans in brutal fashion, establishing themselves as legitimate threats who weren't afraid of anyone regardless of reputation or accomplishments. Their campaign inevitably led them to call out Brock Lesnar, claiming that the Beast incarnate was an old relic from a previous era who was being protected by management because WWE knew he couldn't hang with the new generation of monsters. Bron and Bronson cut promos about how Brock's mystique was built on fighting smaller opponents and that when he faced actual physical threats like them, he'd be exposed as overrated and past his prime. The disrespect was calculated and personal, designed to provoke a response from Brock and force WWE into booking a confrontation. What Bron and Bronson didn't understand was that you don't provoke Brock Lesnar unless you're prepared for consequences that go far beyond what happens in a sanctioned match. Brock's response to the call-outs was ominous silence. He didn't cut promos defending himself or making counter-threats. He didn't petition WWE management for a match to settle the issue. He simply disappeared from WWE television for a couple of weeks, and that silence should have been a warning sign that something terrible was being planned. On Monday Night Raw, Bron Breakker and Bronson Reed were scheduled to appear in a segment where they'd continue their campaign of destruction and further call out Brock Lesnar for refusing to face them. They arrived at the arena early, preparing for their segment and apparently feeling confident that Brock was avoiding them because he feared the matchup. That confidence was about to be shattered in the most violent way imaginable. The attack happened in the parking lot area where WWE talent parks their vehicles. Bron and Bronson were walking from their cars toward the arena entrance when Brock Lesnar appeared seemingly out of nowhere. But he wasn't alone, and he wasn't unarmed. Brock had brought steel chairs, a lead pipe, and what appeared to be brass knuckles, an arsenal that made it immediately clear this wasn't going to be a fair fight or a competitive confrontation. The first anyone knew something was wrong was when security heard shouting and the sound of metal hitting concrete. By the time a cameraman arrived on the scene and started filming, Brock had already landed several devastating blows on both men with the steel chair, and both Bron and Bronson were already bleeding and struggling to defend themselves. The footage that aired later on Raw, heavily edited to remove the most graphic violence, shows Brock Lesnar in a state of controlled rage that's genuinely frightening to watch. He wasn't yelling or showboating or playing to cameras. He was methodically attacking specific body parts with weapons, clearly trying to cause maximum damage with surgical precision. Bron Breakker, despite being one of the most physically imposing wrestlers in WWE, was completely overwhelmed by Brock's assault. The Beast targeted Bron's legs with repeated chair shots, clearly trying to damage his knees and ankles in ways that would prevent him from performing his explosive athletic style. Every time Bron tried to get up or fight back, Brock would hit him with another chair shot that sent him crashing back down. The most disturbing moment involving Bron came when Brock applied what appeared to be a genuine ankle lock with clear intention to cause real damage rather than simulate pain for entertainment. Bron's screams were legitimately terrifying, and even through the edited footage you could see Brock wrenching on the ankle with a level of force that was completely unnecessary for a worked hold. Bronson Reed tried to intervene and protect his partner, but Brock was ready for him. Using the lead pipe as a weapon, Brock targeted Bronson's ribs and midsection with strikes that were so brutal that Reed was gasping for air and potentially suffering internal injuries. The sound of the pipe hitting Bronson's body was sickening even through television speakers, and you could see Reed's face go pale as he struggled to breathe properly. But what made the attack truly horrifying was Brock's verbal commentary during the assault. The cameraman's audio picked up Brock methodically describing what he was doing. "That's your ACL tearing. That's 3 broken ribs. That's your orbital bone fracturing." It was like listening to a surgeon narrate an operation, except the surgeon was deliberately causing damage rather than repairing it. Security personnel arrived quickly and tried to separate Brock from his victims, but the beast incarnate easily fought them off. It took nearly a dozen security guards plus several wrestlers who came running from inside the arena to finally restrain Brock and stop the assault. Even then, Brock was still trying to get back to Bron and Bronson, clearly not satisfied with the damage he'd already inflicted. By the time Brock was finally subdued and forced away from the scene, both Bron Breakker and Bronson Reed were in seriously bad shape. Bron couldn't put weight on his left leg and was clutching his ankle while clearly in severe pain. Bronson was lying on the ground struggling to breathe, with visible injuries to his face and torso that suggested he'd taken catastrophic damage. WWE medical personnel rushed to the scene with stretchers and emergency equipment. Both wrestlers were immediately transported to a local medical facility for evaluation, and the preliminary reports were terrifying. Bron potentially suffered a severe ankle sprain or worse, multiple contusions, and a possible concussion from hitting his head on the concrete during the assault. Bronson potentially suffered broken ribs, internal bruising, facial lacerations requiring stitches, and possible damage to his lungs or organs from the pipe shots to his torso. The Raw broadcast handled the situation by airing edited footage of the attack with commentary expressing shock and concern about what had happened. But backstage, the situation was far more chaotic and disturbing than what viewers saw on television. Multiple wrestlers were reportedly horrified by what Brock had done and questioned whether he'd crossed a line that should result in termination or at minimum a lengthy suspension. Others argued that Bron and Bronson had provoked Brock with personal disrespect and should have known that calling out a legitimate combat athlete who's fought in UFC wasn't going to end with a worked wrestling match. WWE officials held emergency meetings about how to handle the situation from both a legal and public relations standpoint. There were legitimate concerns that Brock's attack could result in criminal charges if Bron and Bronson decided to press them, or civil lawsuits if the injuries were severe enough to warrant legal action. But the most controversial aspect of WWE's response was the apparent decision to turn this legitimate assault into storyline content rather than treating it as a serious workplace violence incident that required disciplinary action. The fact that the footage aired on Raw, even in edited form, suggested that WWE viewed Brock's ambush as content to be exploited rather than a safety violation that needed to be punished. The locker room response has been divided and increasingly tense. Many wrestlers feel that Brock's attack sets a dangerous precedent where performers can commit actual violence against each other outside of sanctioned matches without facing real consequences. If Brock can ambush people in the parking lot with weapons and potentially end their careers, what's to stop other wrestlers from doing the same thing when they feel disrespected? But others argue that professional wrestling has always had elements of legitimate violence when performers go too far, and that Bron and Bronson essentially asked for this response by repeatedly calling out Brock and questioning his legitimacy. The old-school mentality of "don't write checks your body can't cash" applies here. If you're going to publicly challenge someone with Brock's background and reputation, you need to be prepared for consequences that might exceed what you anticipated. The most concerning development is that several younger wrestlers are now reportedly afraid to cut promos calling out established stars because they don't want to risk a similar ambush if their challenge is taken seriously rather than treated as storyline content. This fear creates a chilling effect where rising talent might be hesitant to show the kind of aggressive confidence needed to break through to the main event level. Medical updates on Bron Breakker and Bronson Reed have been limited, but sources close to both wrestlers indicate their injuries are serious enough to sideline them for several weeks at minimum. Bron's ankle injury is reportedly severe enough that he might need surgery if the damage is as bad as preliminary examinations suggest. Bronson's rib injuries are definitely going to require substantial recovery time, and there are concerns about whether he suffered any internal damage that could have long-term health implications. Both wrestlers are reportedly consulting with lawyers about their options, though it's unclear whether they're considering pressing charges against Brock or suing WWE for failing to provide a safe work environment. The legal ramifications could be significant for everyone involved if this situation escalates beyond the wrestling business and into actual criminal or civil court proceedings. Now here's the question that's going to determine whose side you're on. Was Brock Lesnar justified in ambushing and brutally assaulting Bron Breakker and Bronson Reed after they repeatedly disrespected him and called him out, or did he cross an unforgivable line by attacking them with weapons outside of a sanctioned match? Your answer reveals your beliefs about respect in wrestling, whether there are limits to how far performers should go in responding to provocations, and whether legitimate violence has any place in what's supposed to be choreographed entertainment. Here's the even more controversial question: should Bron and Bronson have expected this kind of response when they called out Brock Lesnar, or is victim blaming to suggest they brought this on themselves by being disrespectful? Because there's a real argument that professional wrestlers should be able to cut promos and issue challenges without fearing legitimate assault in response. But there's also an argument that when you repeatedly call out someone with Brock's legitimate fighting background and question their toughness, you're essentially daring them to prove you wrong in the most painful way possible. Tell me in the comments, do you think Brock Lesnar should face serious consequences like suspension or termination for this parking lot ambush, or do you think Bron and Bronson got what they deserved for disrespecting a legend? And here's what I really want to know: if you were Bron Breakker or Bronson Reed, would you want revenge when you returned from injury, or would you be smart enough to back away from this feud and never provoke Brock Lesnar again? Brock Lesnar's devastating ambush of Bron Breakker and Bronson Reed in the WWE Raw parking lot wasn't just a shocking moment of violence, it was a reminder that some people in wrestling operate by completely different rules because their reputation, their background, and their value to the company gives them latitude that ordinary performers don't have. The systematic nature of Brock's attack, targeting specific body parts with weapons to cause maximum career damage, showed a level of premeditation and controlled aggression that goes beyond normal wrestling intensity into something genuinely disturbing. This wasn't the beast incarnate having a spontaneous moment of rage, this was calculated assault with specific goals and methodology. And WWE's apparent decision to turn this legitimate violence into storyline content rather than treating it as a serious workplace safety issue raises uncomfortable questions about what the company is willing to tolerate or exploit when they know it will generate massive attention and ratings. Bron Breakker and Bronson Reed learned the hardest possible lesson: calling out Brock Lesnar isn't like calling out other wrestlers. When you challenge the beast incarnate, you're not issuing a storyline challenge to a sports entertainer, you're provoking someone who's fought in legitimate combat sports and who has demonstrated repeatedly that he's willing to blur the line between performance and reality when he feels it's necessary. The question isn't whether what Brock did was right or justified. Reasonable people can disagree on that. The question is whether WWE can continue to function as a safe work environment when their biggest stars can commit acts of violence like this without facing meaningful consequences, and whether other wrestlers will feel protected or vulnerable knowing that crossing the wrong person could result in a parking lot ambush that ends their career.